Hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. Hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to be comparing watercolour paper and normal paper and see why we would normally use watercolour paper for watercolour paints. So for today's exercise I'm just going to use the Stratford Student cold press and copy paper, so you can see what the difference is between the two. So this is the watercolour. You'll see that it has a little bit of grain to this. You see that? So I'm just going to apply a lot of water to this. Now you should be able to see that it's literally swimming in water. And I'm going to just apply some paint. Now you can see the paint is travelling. And that's the main idea with watercolour. Wet into wet is helping the paint just travel a little bit further than you would with normal paper. So I'm going to let that travel a little bit more. Change my brush. So you can see it's still travelling, it's holding onto the water, and I'm able to just keep applying paint, which of course for many artists that are using watercolour, we need to be able to do quite a lot of wet into wet and be able to get colours to run into each other without actually physically mixing them, which is kind of what I'm doing here, so that they dry without too many brush strokes. I really like how this is travelling across the paper. It means that I can work for so much longer on the wet into wet technique. So it's holding the water really well. So I really like how that is moving, which is why watercolour paper is so important to watercolour artists, is that we can afford to get a lot of water onto the paper without ruining the integrity of the paper. So you can see very quickly I've managed to cover the entire paper. We've got some beautiful marks coming along, which are not done by the brush. Although I've applied with a brush, it's the water that's carrying the pigment and depositing the pigment on the paper. So I'm going to put that to one side, and then we're going to use normal paper so you can see the difference. This is a single sheet of copy paper, the type that you would put in your printer. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to take my big watercolour brush and wet the paper, and this is where you see why it's really hard to use the watercolour paint. So we're going to apply exactly the same that we did before. Now you'll see that the pigment itself is not travelling. It's staying put. It doesn't really want to go anywhere. There's a little bit of travelling, but not as much as I would like. So I'm actually having to move the paint myself. I've got hard lines which I didn't have with the watercolour paper. Here I'm a little bit stuck with the paper holding onto the water and not allowing me to use it as the vehicle for the pigment. So I'm having to apply extra pigment, extra movement on the paper just to get it to move. And I've got this huge great crease in the middle, but you can see I've got hard lines appearing here, which of course I didn't have on the watercolour paper. So we're going to let them dry so that you can see the difference. So I'm hoping that you can see this copy paper. It's still very translucent because it's soaking wet. This is about 15 minutes later. This is almost dry, still a bit damp. You can test it by putting the back of your hand on it. If it's very cool to the touch, you know that it's still slightly wet. But this is still absolutely soaking. I'm not sure how long this is actually going to take to dry on its own. So I'm now going to try a piece of cartridge paper. This was the copy paper. So as you can see, it's really thin, it's really flexible, but it's still not dry. This is a piece of cartridge paper. So this is actually a £160 cartridge paper by Faber Castell. Again, it's really quite flexible, got a quite smooth surface, and we are going to do exactly the same again, but to this paper. Okay, so again, I'm going to apply quite a lot of water, just like I did with the watercolour paper. So this hasn't gone transparent like your copy paper. Oops. And you can see the water is actually travelling quite a way on this. Picked up another colour there. Still, never mind. So remember, this is cartridge paper, which would be the industry standard for drawing on. And just going to do what I did before. Oh, I do like that. I have to admit, I love the way this separates. Oh, look at those. Just because it's moving so far out, I think I'll leave the third one out. Oh, I do like that. But as you can see, it stopped very, very quickly. So although it was moving really quickly to start with, where the water's sunk in, it stopped moving. But I do like the way it does travel. It's always worth playing with papers. I never discount any paper because all of them have very different qualities and are able to do very different things. So again, I'm going to let that dry and see what we have. This is the Faber Castell cartridge paper. Now we are 3 hours later and we still have puddling. The rest of it is actually quite dry, but we still haven't got rid of the puddles. They still haven't dried. I'm hoping you can see the colour changes between the 3 papers. As I move along, you can see that the copy paper here has started to lose the colour.